Well, welcome. Thank you to everyone joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn Climate Resilient Maine Farms. And thank you to everyone who is watching this recording on YouTube. Every 5 years, our lawmakers in Congress must reauthorize the nation's Farm Bill. This is a huge omnibus bill that governs policy in all sorts of areas related to the agricultural sector, from farm income support and food assistance to trade and more. It takes many months to reach a consensus around such a massive bill, and hold on to your hats, this is going to surprise you, Congress is behind schedule. While existing programs will continue at the level that they were last funded, because this is every 5 years, that was way back in 2018, new initiatives like Congresswoman Shelley Pingree's Agricultural Resilience Act and other climate smart measures can't be implemented until they're authorized and funded in the next Farm Bill. This all sounds complicated and a lot of different moving parts. We are so lucky to have with us today Shelley Megquier, who is the Policy and Research Director at Maine Farmland Trust, and Dave Colson, owner of Newly Farm and the Northeast region's farmer representative to the National Organic Farmers Association. Shelley and Dave know more about the Farm Bill than I will ever hope to know, and they are here with us today to share about policies and programs that we need to support farmers and protect Maine's farmland in the face of climate change and all of the challenges our state faces, and what we can do at the local level to address these issues. Thank you for being with us today, Shelley and Dave. My name is Kathleen Neal. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting the environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. A few notes before we dive into today's program. We will hear from Shelley and Dave first, and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait. You can let me know through the chat any questions you may have whenever they occur to you. I will compile them and synthesize them and ask as many as possible following the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties today, please message Maggie Summers through the chat and she will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You will all receive the link in a follow-up email, and you can also look for recordings of all of our programs on YouTube, where there are a number of playlists that will help you focus in on particular topics. Thank you again for joining us. And Shelley and Dave, I will turn it over to you to kick things off.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for that introduction. And it's so nice to be here today and see some familiar faces and names. So I'm just going to take a minute to share my screen here. All right. Hopefully you all are seeing that full screen now. Let me know if not. So thank you again for the introductions. It's really good to be joining Maine conservation voters for this very timely lunch and learn in order to discuss the policies and the programs that are needed to support farmers and protect Maine's farmland in the face of climate change, and what we can do to address these issues. So I'll get us started, and then I'm going to pass things over to Dave. As Kathleen said, I'm Shelley Megquier. I'm the Policy and Research Director at Maine Farmland Trust. Many of you are likely familiar with MFT, or Maine Farmland Trust. We're a member-powered statewide organization that works to protect farmland, support farmers, and advance the future of farming. And since our founding about almost 25 years ago, MFT has helped to permanently protect more than 340 farms across the state and keep more than 60,000 acres of Maine farmland in working production. Our farm network comprises over 500 farms, and our main program areas are farmland protection, farmland access, stewardship, farm business planning, PFAS support, climate resilience, and policy and research.
And I'm Dave Colson, and I am the co-owner, operator of New Leaf Farm in Durham, Maine. We are no longer a commercial farm, but we just recently put a deed restriction on easement on our property to protect the farm into the future. I also work with the Organic Farmers Association. Right now I'm the Northeast Region Farmer Representative and the president of OFA. We provide a voice for certified organic farmers on the national level and lead a national organic farmer movement and try to maintain and create a national policy platform based on the needs of organic farmers. I also am currently the president of the Maine Farmland Trust Board. So pass it back to you, Shelley.
Thanks, Dave. So we're discussing policy here today in partnership with MCV because Maine farmers and community members really understand that decisions made in their town office, in Augusta, and in Washington, D.C. have very profound impacts on day-to-day operations on farms across the state, and also on our local and regional food systems and our farm economy. Public policy shapes the resources that are available to farmers, what land is protected and how, agricultural markets, infrastructure development, the tools that farms have available to them to adapt to changing climate, and really all aspects of our food economy. And this conversation about policy today is particularly timely for multiple reasons. First of all, sort of starting at the local level, decisions are being made in town halls across the state that impact farmers. There are tools that allow communities to support local farms and protect farmland, ranging from zoning regulations to tax incentives, to identifying and promoting farmland access opportunities. I do want to put a plug in for the fact that MFT is going to be releasing a major publication geared towards municipal officials later this month. It's titled Cultivating Maine's Agricultural Future, a Policy and Planning Guide for Towns. And that will share a mix of tools and strategies. So if you're interested, if you work closely with your town government, or even if you're on it, I know this group is pretty well plugged in. And if you're not already on our mailing list, it's a great time to sign up via our website. Secondly, the Maine legislature is in session, working on legislation to support farmers and determining how state resources will be directed. We'll circle back later on in the webinar to some more state level work. And third, as Kathleen mentioned in her lovely introduction, our policymakers in DC are chipping away at the next farm bill. things are moving slowly, as Kathleen mentioned, and big surprise there. But it's still a very important time for influencing federal policy. The delays in passing a farm bill are a challenge for getting new programs in place, and many programs are operating on flatline spending from the last farm bill approval back in 2018. And it's important to recognize that House Republicans are insisting that the next farm bill not add to the debt ceiling, that there be sort of flatline spending for the next farm bill. So there is some general discouragement in Washington, D.C. I was there last week, and there is some discouragement about getting any new programs approved. However, that may sound kind of dismal, but there's a lot of important work to do now. The massive influx of funding that was dedicated to climate and conservation through the Inflation Reduction Act needs to be protected. We need to keep the climate guardrails around this historic investment and ensure that none of that investment is raked back to cover different priorities, to cover other things, but really keep it on climate and conservation. And as you can probably tell already, there's a lot that we could potentially cover in this webinar related to climate policy and Maine farms. As you can tell, we're going to focus in on the Farm Bill during this Lunch and Learn and really talk about the changes that we want to see in the Farm Bill in order to strengthen farmers' ability to be resilient in the face of climate change, as well as changes that will ensure that farms nationwide, not just in Maine, but nationwide, move towards carbon neutrality, really lessening their greenhouse gas emissions and moving us towards a more sustainable and equitable food system. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dave, who's going to share a little bit of an overview on the Farm Bill and some examples of federal programs that address the intersection of climate, farm viability, and conservation, and that are funded through this body of legislation.
Thanks, Shelley. So a little background on the Farm Bill. What we know now is the Farm Bill kind of got started in the 1920s, the early days of the Great Depression. Ag prices were already low, and when the Depression hit, farmers planted more in order to make up for low prices. Exports out of the country obviously fell because the rest of the world was experiencing the Depression as well. And as farms produced more to try and make up for the lost income, that drove prices down even further. So during the New Deal in 1933, the Farm Bill included the creation of 3 different mechanisms, a couple of which are still with us today. One is the Commodity Credit Corporation. This is the group that actually pays out for commodity subsidies. They originally were created to create loans so that farmers could take out a loan at a fixed cost, could plant their crop, and if they couldn't get as much as the loan value was worth, they could sell it to the government, and if they could get more, then they just sold it for a higher price and paid their loan back. And also created some minimum pricing for 3 commodities, corn, cotton, and wheat, which was later negated by the Supreme Court when they ruled that regulation of agricultural production was unconstitutional. A second piece of this original Farm Bill was the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which paid farmers cash to take crops out of production, which many of you have probably heard of before, and to plant conservation crops. There were a lot of unintended consequences from this. A lot of times farmland, which was not really all that productive, was the land that was taken out of production. And so highly valuable farmland was continue to be used in a continuous kind of way. It also meant that in both of these, that those low price loans and money to take land out of agricultural production mostly went to the larger white farmers across the country and helped to deplete the number of farms actually owned by Black and Indigenous and Hispanic farmers at the time. So that began the mistrust amongst people of color of the USDA, which still persists today. So what we know now is the Farm Bill has been continuing to be voted on every 5 or 6 years. It's an omnibus package, which means it contains multiple titles. I think it's around 14 different titles now. They cover things like conservation, beginning farmer training, commodity payments, crop insurance payments, agricultural research, nutrition assistance, rural development, and a number of other things. The Farm Bill has to be voted on, and either a new one put in, or as is happening now, as Shelley mentioned, we're getting continuing resolutions to keep the funding going for those programs that have baseline or mandatory funding. But if the Farm Bill was to expire, it would go back to one of the original laws. I can't remember which year it was, but it would create a farm parity type of thing, which would immediately raise a lot of farm prices, and certainly not what most food buyers want to see happen. So the Farm Bill has a very large impact on farms and agriculture, food nutrition, as I said, and although it covers a wide range of programs, it does not cover farm labor, school meal programs, or the WIC program. So let's move on to our next slide. So this gives you a bit of a graphic around the funding for the Farm Bill. This was created in 2018, which was the last time the Farm Bill was done. Total for that projected over 5 years was $428 billion. And you can see of that food nutrition assistance, primarily Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, which used to be called food stamps, is the largest chunk of that, about 75% of the Farm Bill. Of the other portions, the ag portion, roughly around 25% of the Farm Bill, still is over $100 billion in spending, with commodity payments around $20 billion a year. Now, those commodity payments are going to roughly 39% of the 2.1 million farmers in the United States who receive the vast majority of the subsidies, most of which goes to the largest producers of corn, wheat, soybean, cotton, and rice. As Shelley mentioned, the current leadership in the House Agricultural Committee in particular does not want to see any increase in funding or increase in the budget. So they are asking any of us who are advocating for an increase in funding on any programs we're interested in to figure out where we take the money away from. It's a really good way to pit group against group to fight for the pieces that you're interested in, rather than realizing that there's value to adding funding to some of these things. So we of course would like to see more come out of the commodity and crop insurance part of the pie. because you can see basically where most Maine farms fall, which is in the specialty crop arena. Even our large potato farms are considered specialty crops. So we fall in that 1% for horticulture, forestry, rural development, credit, research, and everything else. So it's a pretty tiny piece of the pie that actually goes to most of the types of farms that we have in the state of Maine. Why does this end up this way? Well, a lot of those commodity products, or pretty much all, well, almost all of those commodity products, but particularly corn, wheat, and soy, are raw agricultural products. So they aren't necessarily the kinds of things that you would go and purchase at the store. Yes, you can buy ground corn or ground wheat or even soybeans at the store, but most of what's grown by the large commodity farms are fracked into smaller pieces and turned either into animal feed for large containment feedlot operations, or they're turned into all the various pieces that go into making high fructose corn syrup or many other processed products, which in my opinion are not as healthy as eating good raw agricultural foods. So let's move on to the next slide. So that all sounds kind of disheartening, but there are some aspects to the Farm Bill that we find advantageous and are helpful to farms, even farms in Maine. So one of the programs available through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or USDA, is the Natural Resource Conservation Service. They've been around again since the Dust Bowl area. They were created to preserve soil and water. Many of the programs in the Natural Resource Conservation Service are utilized by farms, such as soil mapping, which we use quite a bit to understand what's under the soil and how we can use it for agriculture. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the programs that farmers do use through NRCS, or Natural Resource Conservation Service. So I'm going to first pass it back to Shelley to talk about some programs that she works with.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. So first of all, we're going to focus in, so we're trying to focus on NRCS programming that relates to climate as sort of the area of focus for this webinar. There's certainly so many programs, both within the Natural Resources Conservation Service and within USDA overall. It could be like a full day training, although who would want to be on Zoom for a full day? But it could certainly be a full day event to cover everything. But we're trying to hone in on a couple that we think may be of interest. I want to talk first about just farmland protection and access and how that's critical to our thinking about climate change and the Farm Bill. Essentially, farmland protection is important for ensuring that we have the land base to grow our agricultural economy, particularly as more farmers reach retirement age and development pressures increase. Protecting land is also a key natural climate solution by avoiding the greater emissions that are associated with developed land, and also by ensuring that we have the farmland in this country that's needed to support a food economy, and particularly the farmland that we need in Maine to serve our regional food economy in the Northeast and also our local food economy, and to create food security for our state, which I think we realized during the pandemic is very important. Our supply chains are so concentrated with certain agribusinesses being in control of most of the food supply, that having that local food system be vibrant is really important for our food security overall. And we also want to be able to preserve the climate benefits that can be realized when farmers are using climate-friendly practices on the land. So in Maine, less than 5% actually of our working farmland is permanently protected through an agricultural easement. And we really need to be able to accelerate the amount of farmland that we're protecting through conservation easements. And one way of doing that is through leveraging federal funding. The Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, affectionately called the ACIP-ALE program, is managed through NRCS, as you can see from the slide, and it provides really vital funding for agricultural conservation easements. We'll get later on in the presentation, we'll get more into the specifics of what we're hoping to see change in the ACIP-ALE program in the next farm bill, but for now I just kind of want to talk about farmland protection and climate in a more, I guess, theoretical way. So this chart shows the climate mitigation potential of different strategies. It comes from a UMaine report on carbon sequestration potential in Maine. And the green bars on the right are measuring the teragrams of carbon dioxide equivalents of mitigation potential in 2025, essentially millions of metric tons of carbon emissions that can be avoided through specific strategies. And you can see avoided forest conversion as the third one down from the top, and then avoided grassland conversion as the seventh bar down. Farmland protection projects nearly always include, well, not nearly always include woodlands and fields that are part of the farm, but not being actively, are not actively part of the production. So a really important takeaway is that land protection, farmland protection work is already advancing some of the most important climate mitigation strategies that are measurably out there. So we've talked about number one here, farmland protection and access as being critical to climate resiliency, because these efforts both sequester carbon and support local food systems. And then there's also, of course, on-farm conservation and climate-friendly agriculture, which work to mitigate emissions and help farmers adapt in the face of changing conditions. And there's a number of on-farm practices that we're talking about here when we say, you know, climate-friendly agriculture. We're talking about things like reduced tillage or adding cover crops, adding organic matter to the soil, replacing annual crops with perennial systems, and adding, protecting, and growing trees. All right, I think back over to you, Dave. Oops, you're muted.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about a few of the mechanisms and farm programs that farmers are utilizing. So one is through the Natural Resource Conservation Service called EQIP, which stands for Environmental Quality Incentives Program. This program has ongoing baseline funding, so we aren't in danger of losing that funding, but we'd like to see that funding increased. And also the Inflation Reduction Act included about $8.5 billion nationwide for additional monies to go into EQIP. And in 2023, Maine NRCS obligated just under $1 million to the EQIP program projects, but still has 100 projects that did not receive funding. So obviously the demand here outpaces the available funding. Let's go to the next slide. So what are the intended outcomes through EQIP? And as I said, NRCS was started in the 30s to try and protect soil and water. So obviously improved water and air quality, conserved groundwater and surface water, increasing soil health, reducing erosion and sedimentation in streams, improving or creating wildlife habitat, and mitigation against drought and increased water volatility. So as we've seen in Maine, we can go from one summer of very, very dry, and a year or two later, we can be excessively wet. So having to think about all of these different things as farmers these days. Next slide, please. So this was a nice kind of graphic from National Wildlife Foundation, which shows kind of a range of climate smart practices, such as cover crops, different types of grazing, managing the soil, and creating buffer strips around water and streams. Next slide. So here's how on our farm we've used some of this funding for EQIP. So this is from a number of years ago, an overhead view of our farm. We have basically divided the farm into 4 major fields, and have grass stripping, grass ways where we do our driving to access the fields, between the fields and between the larger blocks of farm fields. So each one of these blocks is around a hectare on our farm, or 2¼ acres in size. And they're rotated from one to the next over a period of 4 years. So this rotation does a number of things. It takes the land out of an intensive cultivation routine while we're growing, and puts it into a 2-year cover crop, or green manure, as we sometimes call them, in order to reinvigorate the soil. So in this case, we have 2 fields, that one in production, one is working towards production, and then one in a green manure or cover crop, and another that's just being established in that. So next slide, please. So this is what that looks like on the ground. So we grow grasses and legume crops in with the grass. So it's a nice combination for building organic matter, and particularly the microbial life in the soil. The grasses supply the carbon end of the spectrum, and the clovers provide the nitrogen end of the spectrum. Clovers are legume, and they have a symbiotic relationship with a microorganism on their root system that's able to pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and provide it to the clover plant, or the legume plant, which then, when it's turned into the soil, provides that nitrogen to future plant growth of other crops. Now, legumes are the only plant of which there are many, many species. I think it's something close to 4,000 species in the world of legume. And it's traditionally been a way that farmers provide nitrogen and nutrients to the soil. Unfortunately, we've moved beyond these legume growing crops to utilizing chemical nitrogen, which is basically made from natural gas. So the nitrogen is broken out of the natural gas and then injected into the soil for more crop growth. But this practice of using grasses and legumes can create a soil health that then not only helps to protect the soil, helps to grow the more microorganisms, helps to build organic matter, and it provides nutrients to the next year's crops. Next slide. Another practice we've used and had funding for, and I should say all of these we have received some funding for. In the case of the cover crops, the NRCS will actually pay for the seed and our time planting them. And in this case, they aren't paying actually for the mulch itself. We grow that on the farm, but they pay for the practice, the labor of mulching these different areas. So believe in this foreground, we have a number of herbs and other things. There's celery to the left, basil in the middle, parsley, fennel, so on. These are perennial crops that are going to stay in the soil for the whole summer. So having them mulched cuts down on weeding, and it also puts a lot of carbon into the soil, which takes quite a while to break down. And then next slide. We also have been doing some composting on our farm. We were fortunate to live near a horse farm just down the road from us, who didn't have a good way of disposing of their manure other than dumping it into a field. And so we started taking their manure and worked out an arrangement with a fairly large local restaurant and banquet center that would bring their food waste out to us on a almost daily basis during the growing season. And we would mix the manure with the food waste and create these long windrow piles of compost. Here we're actually utilizing a wood ash product from bioash or from biofuel electrical generation. This is the ash that's left over once the wood is burned to create electricity. We're having it dumped on our compost pad so that we can then spread it onto our fields. So the NRCS actually paid for us to put this pad in so that the various things that we're mixing and using on the pad don't end up polluting our groundwater. Okay, I think I'll pass it back to you then, Shelley.
Thanks so much, Dave. It's great to see some specific examples from on farm in terms of how these federal funds can be used for real impact. So thanks for sharing those. So kind of transitioning to looking ahead and what we want to see for policy changes as we think about building resilience for Maine farmers and working to ensure that the next Farm Bill focuses resources appropriately. So sort of some big picture Farm Bill asks are that ask around protecting that I mentioned earlier, like protecting the climate guardrails in IRA, Inflation Reduction Act funding, and ensuring that none of that funding for conservation gets raked back. And I bring that up because it's a threat. Like there is some desire to rake back that funding and reallocate it towards things like crop subsidies for big commodity crop farmers. So that is like sort of top priority. The second top priority is around strengthening existing conservation programs to make them more accessible for all types of farmers operating at all scales, as well as just easier to use overall. And I don't think we're going to have too much time to talk about state policy, but I will just say that, of course, there's state programs that support our farms, and especially target climate resiliency. You know, there's the working Farmland Access and Protection Program that does farmland protection within the state through the Land for Maine's Future. There's the Maine Healthy Soils Program, which was established in 2021 and is really getting off the ground, but has some enormous potential to support all types of farmers with healthy soils practices. There's also a drought relief program. All of these programs really need sustainable sources of funding and increased political commitment to really serve Maine farms. So when we think about the Farm Bill and what we'd like to see change, I mentioned the ACEP-ALE program earlier. And it is a relatively new program. It's about 10 years old, and in some ways it's still being fine-tuned. So some things that we prioritize for changes in the next Farm Bill related to the ACEP-ALE program. One is an ability for NRCS to prioritize projects that maintain affordability protections. So land is not just being conserved, but in that conservation, there's more assurance that there can be a transfer to the next generation of farmers through something called an option to purchase that agricultural value. We also really recognize that NRCS is strapped for capacity, so have an ask around increasing the capacity at NRCS to be able to process land protection projects more efficiently. Thankfully, with IRA funding, they're starting to be able to do that, but that's something that we need to make sure is long-term. And then last year, just making the buy, protect, sell provision work within the ASABAIL program. There's a lot more to say about buy, protect, sell, but I'll just say for this purpose that it's a farmland access tool. And it was established, but hasn't really been fully functional at the federal level paired with ASABAIL funds. We've been working with Senator Angus King's staff, and he is championing a marker bill that would do that, allow for buy, protect, sell to be more fully functional at the federal level paired with ASABAIL money. So it's clear, of course, that climate change is one of the most daunting challenges of our time and will have significant impacts on Maine's agricultural sector. Our farmers are already experiencing climate change impacts and are needing to adapt to extreme weather events, excessive precipitation and drought, and protecting soils and building soil health are really important climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. So talking more about the EQIP program, which Dave was just sharing examples of how it's been used on his farm. This is a very popular program in Maine, as has been mentioned. And we do think that there's some ways in the next farm bill that it could be strengthened. One way is to increase technical assistance capacity for service providers and at NRCS in order to support producers as they access funds. And then reducing barriers to access, particularly for smaller producers, and prioritizing soil health building practices within EQIP applications. One of the bills called a marker bill, it's like sort of a bill that's introduced in hopes that it will be wrapped into the eventual farm bill. But one of those that we're supporting is called the Small Farm Conservation Act, which essentially requires for a small farm EQIP sub-program to be established. And of course, we support farms of all sizes at Maine Farmland Trust and want to see all farms thrive. But for small Maine farms in particular, it can be difficult for them to access and utilize EQIP funding, just because the smaller the operation, the harder it is for them to go through the application process. And sometimes it just doesn't pay off, frankly. And so this bill, if made into law, would streamline EQIP, so it'd be easier for smaller farm businesses, including those operated by like young and beginning farmers, to be able to access financial assistance and technical assistance. And this is a bill, thankfully, that both Senator King and Representative Pingree are co-sponsoring. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity. So we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the Agricultural Resilience Act, which is a bill championed by Representative Shelley Megquier. It has been introduced in previous Congresses, but it hasn't successfully passed yet. And it was reintroduced in 2013 with hopes that its content will be integrated into the final version of this next farm bill. It's a huge, really ambitious bill. And again, this is something, not to be a broken record, but we could probably have a whole separate webinar on the ARA. It's really a very laudable effort by Representative Pingree. And there are some sort of break-off bills that have been introduced separately in hopes that if the whole Agricultural Resilience Act doesn't make it into the next farm bill because of the challenges that we've mentioned, maybe parts of it will. So that's exciting to see, and I think there's a real effort being led by Representative Pingree to get bipartisan support for certain elements of the bill. So I'm gonna skip some of this content, Dave, and pass it over to you just so we can move to question and answer and have time for that. But do you want to talk about research a little bit?
Yeah, you want to go to the next slide? Or is this the one? This is the one. Okay, great. So what I like about the Agricultural Resilience Act is that Shelley and the others working on it tried to take a holistic approach to how farmers access assistance and how the Farm Bill might assist them in helping to reduce the effects of climate change. It creates climate hubs, which have to do with looking at a region, a climate region, so New England or the Northeast, the Southeast, the West. We have different issues that would need to be solved in different ways. So it encourages states to get involved in climate hubs so that they can share research. It also looks at the USDA programs as a whole rather than single pieces. And finally, does encourage more research. I think, one of the things that has gotten real popular in the last number of years is climate credits. So paying for offsets. But it's unclear whether those offsets are really doing what they're intended to do. And some of the things that are being pushed as important for mitigating climate change, like no-till practices that utilize herbicides, are questionable in terms of how well they sequester carbon and what other effects they're having on the environment. So even though sometimes research can sound like we're just passing the buck down the road further, I really do think there's need for more research, specifically in some of these different climate hubs, to understand what it is we're doing and the effects that we're having. And I'll pass it back to you, Shelley.
Thanks. So we want to kind of wrap up today by sharing some ideas for how you can take action. As I started out at the webinar by saying, like, this is a really ideal time to be communicating with members of Congress. House and Senate Ag committees are actively working on the Farm Bill. So here are some ideas for how you can take action. You can reach out to Maine members of Congress who are active on climate and agriculture and share your thanks and what it means to you. If you want further action from certain members of Congress, you can also ask for that. You can send a letter or call Maine's members and tell them about your priorities for the Farm Bill. You can tell your story on social media or in some other way to explain what climate-friendly agriculture means to you as a Maine resident. You can talk to your friends or contacts in other states, and this is particularly important, contacts in states with members that are on the House or Senate agricultural committees. Just reaching out and sharing your perspective, we can influence our peers quite a bit. And sometimes those that need to be convinced are members of Congress representing other states, not our Maine members, who are pretty supportive. You can stay tuned for recommendations coming out of the Maine Climate Council's Natural and Working Lands Working Group. We didn't get to talk about that too much, but if anyone wants to contact me afterwards or other MFT staff, I'm happy to dig into it more. It's a really exciting process. You can tell your state representative or senator how much you value farmland conservation. And you can also sign up to receive action alerts from Maine Farmland Trust. So Dave and I have compiled some resources that may be of interest for those that want to dig in a little bit deeper. And then we just want to thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Dave and Shelley. That was just a phenomenal introduction to a really complex and really important piece of of legislation and work. So thank you. Don't worry, everyone. There was all of those fabulous resources and opportunities to take action will be included in this afternoon's follow-up email, along with links to sign up for Maine Farmland Trust messages and to get access to Shelley's great brain for further questions. So thank you. We do have a little bit of time for questions. And so let's just dive right in. Before we get into detail, I really appreciated that graph or that chart of how the Farm Bill is allocated. And there's a question from one of our participants about why nutrition programs are such a big chunk of the Farm Bill. I mean, obviously farms provide food. I get that connection. But a lot of the details of these programs seem really unrelated. How did that come to pass?
Oh, well, you'd have to go back in history there. So obviously during the Great Depression and food lines there was a recognition that the federal government had to play some role in that as well. And then just as the Farm Bill and some of these programs changed a lot over the years, the food assistance changed over the years as well. Back in the 1960s, there was a program where instead of trying to control farm prices, a lot of the big commodities, including dairy products, were purchased by the federal government and held as kind of a reserve. And then the idea was that if prices went too high on those commodities, then they could put them into the marketplace, much like we think of our oil, our petroleum reserve functions now. The federal government found themselves with a large amount of some of these commodities, and so they started providing those as food assistance. One of the difficulties at the time was a lot of people didn't really know what to do with a bag of lentils. So there also had to be nutrition education programs started. So that's also under that nutrition piece. So there is money that goes to different states. Usually the nutrition education goes through the state extension, agricultural extension program. And they hold trainings and teachings for people that are now receiving WIC or SNAP funding. So obviously, we don't think a whole lot about where money from the federal government is going, but obviously a big chunk of that that's in the Farm Bill does go to supplemental nutrition. And it's a little overwhelming sometimes to realize just how much need there is across the country for that funding. The other interesting thing that I'll just note is that you may have heard over the last number of years, it kind of happens every time the Farm Bill comes up, that some want to divorce supplemental nutrition away from the actual commodity side of the Farm Bill. And the reason those were kind of put together was that the cities, the bigger cities, were more interested in the nutrition aid because they had more people that needed that aid. And the rural areas were more interested in commodity and insurance programs to protect the farms. So they coupled the two together so that there generally has been agreement over the years to keep the basic funding going of those two parts of the Farm Bill. But part of the reason is that each side has something to gain, the rural areas and the urban areas.
Thank you. That is really helpful. And of course, it all comes down to that pragmatism of how do you make a deal, right? Everybody needs to get something. Okay. I think that the thing that's hard for me to wrap my head around is that there's such fundamentally different kinds of need, and the idea that they'd be in competition with each other for a limited pot of money of funding is just really tough to wrap your head around, because we certainly, I don't think any of us would ever suggest that we not meet the nutritional needs through those programs. But boy, climate smart resilience, climate smart farms, I don't want to take any money away from that either. So that is complicated, and maybe a little insight into why it takes so long and is such hard work. Speaking of the climate resilience pieces, I know there are so many places that this work happens. And just to clarify, I know we were all so excited to see some great climate smart agriculture and conservation provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. Not a bill title that makes you think this is about farms, but hey, we'll go with it. Are those programs, were those new programs that got stood up by the IRA that aren't being funded because of where the Farm Bill is, or are they already happening? Are they on hold? Are they just, where are they?
Yeah, I can take that one and try to be brief. So those, the IRA range of investments made through the IRA, of course, is vast. But the pieces related to conservation that we care a lot about was dedicated funding for the EQIP program, which we talked about a lot in this webinar, the ASAP Ale program, which we also chatted, the Conservation Stewardship program, which we didn't talk about, and then maybe also a couple others that were less, but huge amounts of investment in those three programs. And that funding those were programs that already existed. It was recognized by our policymakers that there was real potential to build out those programs and to see a lot of good impacts to the climate through the build out of those programs. And so those dollars are flowing out. There's no hold on them just because the Farm Bill is on hold. They are, few. They're reaching Maine farmers and are hugely impactful to farmers in Maine and across the country.
The one thing I would add is that the Farm Bill is the authorization of these programs. So that's why we can't add any new things until they're actually authorized through another Farm Bill. And then those programs that we call mandatory or have baseline funding continue even with a continuing resolution. The ones that don't are the smaller programs, often have big effects on smaller farms, particularly ones in Maine, don't have that baseline or mandatory funding, and they have to be appropriated every year. So that's why you have these two pieces. You have the writing of the Farm Bill to authorize programs, and then the annual appropriations process to actually put money into those programs that don't have baseline.
Thank you for laying that out so clearly. And what I really want to ask next is, Dave, you're a farmer and a policy expert. Do you have to be both to be successful at farming these days? Wow, that's a lot of specialized knowledge.
Well, I don't know if you have to, but it certainly helps. I mean, I am so impressed with Maine farmers, especially so many of the young folks that have jumped into farming in the last 10 or 15 years. They come with a lot of savvy, a lot of knowledge of a variety of things. Many of them have had either education or experiential learning other than farming, and that they have a savvy around computers and marketing, um, and so I am often not surprised at how much a lot of these folks know about the Farm Bill, what's in it, and what are the programs that they are interested in.
That's really exciting, and I'm so glad that that next generation of farmers has incredible mentors to look up to and incredible resources for the points where they kind of hit the wall. And thank you both for helping us see how we can fit into this. Thank you for being available. There are a whole bunch of questions that we didn't even get to. So I have a feeling we will revisit this again. Until then, thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Dave. Thank you to all of you for being with us today. We'll be back in this space next week to learn a little bit about the National Popular Vote Compact. Maine's legislature is considering entering into this compact right now. We are not the only ones. It is a really exciting initiative, and we will have our good friends from the League of Women Voters and the National Popular Vote Compact with us next week. We will see you then. Until then, have a great weekend. It's supposed to be weirdly warm, which is another reason that we need to be thinking about climate smart agriculture. So thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.